Clara Holt pressed the pen against the marriage document so hard the nib nearly tore through the paper. Her hand did not shake. She had decided somewhere between the moment her father said Harold Vance's name and the moment she walked into this office that she would not give these men the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Across the table, the man who had just paid $700 for the right to call her his wife was watching her with dark, weather-worn eyes that held something she had not expected to find there. Not triumph, not possession, guilt, deep, unmistakable, and entirely unguarded guilt. And in that single, unprotected moment, Clara understood that whatever this arrangement was, it was not what either of them had been told. If this story moves something in you, stay with me until the very end, and drop the name of your city in the comments below so I can see how far this story travels. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. The morning it happened, Clara was in the back of her father's shop, reconciling the ledger she had been keeping for 3 years, the only surviving record of a business that had once been something worth recording. The numbers had not changed overnight. They never did. $712 owed to the First Territorial Bank of Abilene, Kansas, with a final notice dated the 14th of September, 1883, which was tomorrow. She had looked at those numbers so many times, they had stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like a sentence. She heard her father's boots on the stairs before she heard his voice, and she already knew from the heaviness of each step that something had broken. "Clara." His voice came through the doorway before he did. "Put that ledger down." She did not put it down. "Whatever you're going to say it with me, looking at these numbers, because they are the only honest thing left in this building." George Holt stepped into the back room, and Clara saw immediately that he had been crying, which she had not seen him do since her mother's funeral 6 years ago. He was a large man, made small by something, and she felt the first real crack of fear move through her chest. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me what you did." "Clara, please." "Tell me what you did, Father." He sat down heavily in the chair across from her, and he pressed both hands flat on the table, like a man trying to keep himself from being swept away. "Harold Vance came to see me last night," he said, "after you were asleep." Harold Vance. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Clara set the ledger down very carefully. "He came with a proposition," her father continued. "A way to settle the debt without foreclosure, without me going to the labor camp, without us losing everything we have left." "What kind of proposition?" Her father looked at the table. "There's a farmer, name of Eli Calloway, got a spread about 4 miles east of town. Vance says Calloway needs a wife, a real partner, to help work the land. Vance has offered to forgive the entire debt and sign over a clean title to the store if—" He stopped. "If what?" "If you agree to marry him. Today." The word today hit her like a physical thing. Clara stood up so fast the chair scraped across the floor and her father flinched. "Today," she repeated. "The legal papers are already drawn up. Vance had his man do them last night. Calloway has agreed. All that's needed is your signature." "My signature." She laughed, and it came out wrong, too sharp, too bright. "You are sitting there telling me that Harold Vance drew up papers to sell your daughter to a stranger, and you are asking me for my signature as though I am a bill of sale. You are not a bill of sale." "Then what am I, Father? Because from where I am standing, I look exactly like one." George Holt's jaw worked. "You're 20 years old and unmarried in a territory where that means you have no options and no future. At least this way." "At least this way what?" "At least this way, I have a roof over my head in a stranger's house. At least this way, you keep your store and your pride, and I keep nothing." Her voice was shaking now, and she could not stop it. "You told me 2 weeks ago that we would find another way. You promised me we would go to the circuit judge, that we would contest the original loan documents because Victor's signature was forged. The judge won't see us until October. Vance won't wait until October. Then we make him wait. He won't, Clara." Her father's voice broke on her name. He has the sheriff in his pocket. He has 3 deputies who will be at that door tomorrow morning with papers that will put me on a chain gang by noon. Is that what you want? You want to watch your father dragged out of here in irons. Clara stood very still in the middle of the room and felt the walls closing inward from every direction. She thought about the circuit judge who would not come until October. She thought about the sheriff who was Harold Vance's creature. She thought about the forged signature on a loan her father had never taken, and about the man who had forged it, Victor Holt, her father's own brother, who had disappeared 6 months ago with every cent of their savings and left them here to answer for it. "What do you know about this man?" she finally said. "Calloway." Her father's shoulders dropped with relief so profound it made her angrier. "Vance says he's decent, works hard, keeps to himself, lost his father young, built the farm up on his own." Vance says. Clara's voice was flat and cold. "And you believe what Harold Vance says?" "I believe I have no other choice." "There is always another choice. You're just too afraid to take it." She picked up the ledger and set it on the shelf with exact controlled movements. "Where does this signing happen?" "Vance's office, 9 o'clock. "Then I will be there at 9 o'clock. She moved past him toward the door. "But I want you to understand something clearly, Father. I am not doing this for you. I am not doing this because I forgive you or because I think you were right. I am doing this because I refuse to let Harold Vance put you in chains over a debt that was never legally yours in the first place, and I refuse to let him win this particular game today. But this is not over. Whatever he thinks he's gotten away with, it is not over." Harold Vance's office occupied the best corner of the best building on the main street of Abilene, Kansas, and it looked exactly like the inside of a man who believed he deserved to own things. Dark wood, heavy furniture, a framed portrait of himself on the wall behind his desk. He was standing when Clara walked in, which she took note of because men like Vance did not stand for people they considered beneath them, which meant he was performing something. "Miss Holt." His smile was wide and smooth. "I'm glad you could join us." "I'm not here voluntarily, Mr. Vance, so let's not pretend this is a social occasion." She looked around the room and found the other man immediately, not because he was loud or prominent, but because he was standing in the corner, like someone who had not been told where else to put himself. Eli Calloway was taller than she had expected, with the kind of leanness that came from actual labor rather than fashion, and he was looking at the floor with his hat in his hands, turning the brim in a slow, steady circle that told her he had been standing there long enough to develop the habit. He looked up when she came in, and their eyes met, and neither of them spoke. "Splendid," Vance said, moving around his desk with the satisfaction of a man overseeing a transaction he had engineered. "Now that we're all present, I thought we might take a moment. I have one question before I sign anything," Clara said, and she was looking at Eli Calloway when she said it, not at Vance. "Did you ask for this?" Calloway's jaw tightened slightly. "Ma'am, this arrangement. Did you go to Mr. Vance and tell him you wanted a wife secured through a debt transaction, or did Mr. Vance come to you?" Something moved across Calloway's face, quick and complicated. He glanced at Vance for the space of half a second, then looked back at her. "He came to me," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, careful in the way of a man who chose his words because he had learned that the wrong ones cost you. Said he knew a family in a difficult situation. Said it might be a mutual benefit. A mutual benefit. Clara turned to Vance. "And what benefit do you receive from this arrangement?" "Mr. Vance, you're forgiving $700 of debt and gifting a clean title to a store that holds some value. What exactly are you getting in return?" Vance's smile did not waver. "The satisfaction of keeping a good family from hardship, Miss Holt. Some of us are moved by more than financial consideration." "No one who runs a bank is moved by more than financial consideration, Mr. Vance. Let's not insult each other." She looked at the papers on the desk. "Give me something to write with." She signed her name in full Clara Margaret Holt, in the clearest handwriting she possessed, because she wanted there to be no question later about what had happened here and who had done it. Her father's hand shook when he added his own signature. Vance witnessed both with the pleasured efficiency of a man collecting something he had been patient to acquire. Eli Calloway signed his name last, and Clara noticed he signed it without ceremony or hesitation. Just a clean, straightforward signature, the signature of someone who had already made his decision and was past arguing with it. "The ceremony is at 11, Vance announced. "Reverend Aldrich is expecting you at the First Methodist." "You've already arranged the Reverend," Clara said. "I like to be thorough." "I'm certain you do." The church smelled of old wood and candle wax, and the particular silence of a building that was used less for comfort than for performance. Clara walked down the aisle beside her father, who held her arm with both hands, like a man who knew he was the reason she was walking somewhere she had not chosen to walk. She did not look at the handful of townspeople scattered in the pews. She could hear them well enough without looking the low murmur of voices doing what voices in small towns always did when something happened that could be discussed afterward. Poor girl. That's George Holt's daughter, the one whose uncle ran off with the money. Marrying a dirt farmer to settle debts, same as paying off a horse note. What a shame. Pretty thing like that. Eli Calloway was standing at the altar with the same stillness he'd had in Vance's office, his hat now held at his side, his dark hair pushed back from his forehead in a way that suggested effort rather than ease. He was looking at the Reverend when she came down the aisle, and he did not turn to watch her approach, which struck her as either deeply rude or deeply considerate, and she could not yet determine which. Reverend Aldrich moved through the words with the brisk efficiency of a man performing a task rather than witnessing a sacrament. Clara answered when she was supposed to answer. She heard Eli's voice respond beside her low and even, and she thought it was the voice of a man who was also performing something, also holding something very controlled and careful inside himself that he did not intend to show. When the Reverend said, "You may kiss the bride," Eli Calloway turned to her, and she saw that same flash of guilt again, raw and brief, before his expression went neutral. He did not move toward her. He waited. "We don't have to," he said so quietly, only she could hear it. She studied his face for a moment. "It's expected." "A lot of things are expected," he said. "Doesn't always make them right." She looked at him. "You're an unusual man, Mr. Calloway." "Eli," he said, "if we're going to do this, you might as well use my name." She gave a small nod, and he leaned down and pressed his lips to her cheek, brief and formal, as a letter of introduction, and stepped back. Behind them, someone in the pews made a sound that might have been disappointment. Outside on the church steps, Harold Vance shook Eli's hand with the warmth of a man who had just concluded a profitable deal, which he had, though not the deal he had shown to anyone in that building. "You're a good man, Calloway," he said, and clapped him on the shoulder. Eli looked at the hand on his shoulder for a beat longer than was comfortable. "I'll be in touch about those back payments," he said. "Soon as the harvest comes in." Vance's smile shifted almost imperceptibly. "Of course, no rush at all." Clara filed that exchange away, in the part of her mind she used for things that did not yet make sense, but would eventually. Her father embraced her on the steps with desperate force, his arms shaking around her, and she stood inside the embrace without returning it. "Write to us," he said into her hair. "Please write to us, Evie." She used to love that name. He had called her that since she was 4 years old. She pulled back slowly and looked at his face, at the relief written there, alongside the guilt, and she felt something old and painful settle in her chest, like a stone finding the bottom of deep water. "I'll write when I have something to say," she told him. The wagon Eli drove was a working wagon, nothing elegant about it, with a canvas-covered bed that held farm supplies and a mule who appeared deeply indifferent to the whole proceeding. He helped her up onto the seat with a hand that was scarred across the knuckles and calloused at the palm, and then he climbed up the other side and took the reins, and they moved down the main street of Abilene without looking back at the people still watching from the church steps. They rode in silence for nearly a mile before Clara spoke. "The back payments," she said. "What did you mean when you said that to Vance?" Eli kept his eyes on the road. "When Vance came to me with this arrangement, he offered to forgive what I owe him in exchange for taking you on. Said it was a charitable gesture." A pause. "I told him I'd pay back every cent as soon as I was able. I don't want anything from that man that I haven't earned." Clara turned to look at him directly. "Why?" "Because men like Vance don't forgive debts out of charity." His jaw set in a way she was beginning to recognize as the physical expression of something he was working to keep measured. "They forgive them because they're buying something. I just don't know yet what he thinks he's bought." The honesty of it landed on her like cold water, bracing and necessary. "You knew that going in." "I suspected it, couldn't prove it." He glanced at her sidelong. "Your question in his office about whether he came to me or I came to him, you suspected it too." "I've been watching Harold Vance operate in this town for 3 years, Clara said. "He does not do anything that doesn't benefit Harold Vance. The question is what he wants from your farm specifically." Eli was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, lower, like a man admitting something he had been resisting. "My father bought that land in 1861. Good land, well watered, sits on top of the best aquifer in this part of the county. Vance has been trying to acquire it one way or another since my father died." He turned to look at her fully. "He made an offer 6 months ago. I refused. 3 months ago, he bought up every note I'd taken against the farm from other lenders. Now he holds most of my debt in one place." Clara felt the shape of it assemble in her mind with the same clarity she brought to the ledger numbers. "He's consolidating leverage," she said. "If he can get you into enough debt under one roof, he can call it in whenever it's most damaging." "That's what I believe." "And he arranged this marriage because a man with a wife and a household has more to lose and more reason to accept whatever terms are offered." Eli looked at her with something new in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like recognition. "You're quick." "I kept my father's books for 3 years and watched his business get dismantled piece by piece by a man who never showed his hand until it was too late," Clara said. "I am very quick, Mr. Calloway. You'd do well to remember that." "Eli," he said again, and this time it sounded less like a correction and more like an offering. She turned back to the road. "Eli," she said. "Then you can call me Clara." The Calloway farm appeared in the late afternoon light as they came over a gentle rise in the land, and Clara allowed herself to look at it without judgment, which required some effort. The house was small and weather-worn, but solidly built with a stone foundation that spoke to someone having done it correctly the first time, even if the paint had not been refreshed in some years. The barn was in better condition than the house, which told her something about the man beside her and what he prioritized. A garden ran along the south side of the house, struggling, but not surrendered. The land itself was the best thing rolling in green gold in the September afternoon, richer than it appeared at first glance. "It's not what you're used to," Eli said, and she heard the defensive edge that he'd tried to keep out of his voice and hadn't entirely succeeded. "I grew up above a dry goods store in Abilene," Clara said. "Let's not assume what I'm used to." He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, and for the first time she caught the edge of what might have been a real expression beneath all the careful neutrality. He pulled the wagon to a stop beside the house and climbed down, then came around to her side. "I want to say something before we go inside," he said. He was standing beside the wagon looking up at her with his hat in his hands again, and he looked like a man who had been rehearsing this and was not certain it had come out right in rehearsal either. "This arrangement is not what I would have chosen if circumstances had been different. I don't know what Vance told your father about me or what picture he painted, but I want you to hear the truth from me directly." Clara looked down at him and waited. "My farm is in debt. The land is good, but I have been working it alone for 4 years and I cannot keep up with everything that needs doing. Vance has been pulling strings to make sure I stay underwater. This marriage, the way it was arranged, I'm not proud of it. I didn't go looking for a wife through a debt transaction. But when Vance brought the proposition, I saw two things clearly. He stopped. Say the two things, Clara said. I saw that your family was being used, and that saying no wouldn't save you from that. It would just mean someone else agreed to the arrangement instead of me. He looked at her steadily. And I saw that I needed someone with a clear head and a strong back, someone who could help me figure out what Vance is actually after before he finds a way to take this land. I don't need a wife in the way that word usually means. I need a partner who can think. Clara considered him for a long moment. The late afternoon wind moved through the grass around them, and the mule shifted his weight impatiently. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 6 months, she said. I figured you'd see through anything less. She climbed down from the wagon without taking his offered hand, not out of hostility, but out of habit, and she looked at the house and then at the land stretching away toward the horizon, and she made the kind of internal accounting she had learned to make quickly. Show me the inside, she said. The main room was spare and clean, in the way of a man who had been living alone long enough to reduce everything to what was strictly necessary. A cast-iron stove, a table with 2 chairs, shelves with basic supplies stacked in orderly rows. A rocking chair in the corner, made of dark wood, beautiful despite its age, clearly made by someone who knew what they were doing. A door to the single bedroom stood open, and through it she could see a plain bed frame, a mattress, and a trunk. "Where do you sleep?" she asked directly. Eli stopped in the middle of the room. "The barn," he said. "Or the chair if the weather's bad." Clara turned to face him. "We are legally married." "Yes." "And you intend to sleep in your barn?" "I intend to sleep wherever you're comfortable having me sleep," he said. "Which I'm guessing, given that we have known each other for approximately 4 hours, is not in the same room as you." Clara looked at him for a long, assessing moment. She had expected to fight for this. She had prepared during the ride out a series of firm declarative statements about what she would and would not accept, and she felt slightly disoriented to find that the fight was not materializing. "That is a reasonable position," she said. "I have a few of those occasionally. Don't push it." She turned back to the main room and ran her hand along the shelf edge, checking the sturdiness. "The stove works. Burns hot on the left side. Takes some getting used to." "What do you have for supper?" "Salt pork, dried beans, cornmeal, half a wheel of cheese from the neighbors." "That's enough." She moved toward the stove with the purposeful stride of someone who had decided to be useful, because being useful was the only thing she knew how to do when she was afraid. "Start the fire and show me where you keep things." Eli watched her for a moment, and she could feel it without turning around, that particular quality of attention from someone trying to understand who they were dealing with. "You don't have to cook tonight," he said. "You've been through enough today." "Cooking is something I know how to do," Clara said. "Right now, I need to do something I know how to do, so start the fire." He started the fire. They ate at the small table as the sky outside the one good window shifted through its sunset colors, and Clara asked questions, because questions were information, and information was the only currency she fully trusted. She asked about the farm, about the debt structure, about every transaction Eli had made with Harold Vance, and the precise language of every agreement. She asked about the aquifer that sat beneath the land. She asked about neighboring farms, and which ones were also struggling, and whether any of them had had dealings with Vance that followed a similar pattern. Eli answered all of it with the steady patience of a man who was not accustomed to being listened to, and was recalibrating in real time. He told her things he had probably not told anyone, working through the history of the land and his father's death, and the years of slowly accumulating debt that always seemed to outpace the harvest by just enough to keep him dependent on lenders. He told her about Ruth McAllister, the widow who farmed the land to the north, and who had managed to keep Vance at arm's length for a decade through methods Eli had never fully understood. He told her about James Whitfield, his oldest friend, who had left farming to study law in Kansas City, and who had returned to Abilene 6 months ago to set up a practice. "A lawyer," Clara said. Not much of one yet. He's just starting. A lawyer who knows your situation and knows this land is the one thing Harold Vance wants and cannot seem to get, Clara said. Have you told him about Vance consolidating your debt? Eli looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, his eyes were very dark and entirely focused. No, he said. Why not? Because I thought it was my problem to solve. It's not your problem to solve, Clara said. It is a problem that was designed to be unsolvable by one person alone. That's the entire point of how Vance built it. She set down her fork. Tomorrow I want to go through every document you have related to your debts. Every note, every agreement, every communication from Vance's bank. I want to understand the exact legal structure of what he holds. Eli was very still on the other side of the table. You can read contracts. I kept the books for a business for 3 years, including all correspondence with creditors. She held his gaze. I can read contracts, Mr. Calloway. I can also read people, which is why I know that Harold Vance is not as secure in his position as he appeared this morning. Confident men do not arrange marriages to tighten their leverage. They call in debts. The fact that he needed this, she gestured between them, means there is something in your situation that a straight foreclosure could not give him. I intend to find out what that is. Eli Calloway looked at her across the lamplight and the remains of their first shared meal, and she saw something move through his expression that was neither guilt nor careful neutrality, but something entirely different. Something that looked for just a moment like relief so profound it was almost painful. I made a mistake, he said quietly. Clara went still. What kind of mistake? When Vance came to me, I thought I was agreeing to this arrangement to protect your family from a worse outcome, he said. I told myself that was the reason. He was quiet for a moment. The truth is, I was also frightened. I have been frightened for 2 years that I was going to lose this land, and I didn't know how to stop it. And when Vance offered a way out, I took it without asking enough questions. He looked directly at her. You asked more questions in one afternoon than I've asked in 2 years. I'm sorry that you're the one who had to pay for my fear. The apology sat between them clean and unadorned, not seeking absolution, just stating a fact. Clara had not been prepared for that either. We both paid for it, she said. The question now is what we do about it. She pushed back from the table and began clearing the dishes with systematic efficiency. You should sleep in the barn tonight. I need to think without company. Understood. But Eli. She stopped with her back to him. I am not here because I had no choice. I signed that document because it was the most useful option available to me in that moment. I intend to make it continue to be the most useful option available, which means I intend to help you keep this farm. Not for you, for us both. Because Harold Vance arranged this marriage thinking it would make you easier to control, and I intend to spend every day proving him wrong about that. She heard him stand up from the table. Clara, he said. She turned. Thank you, he said simply, for being honest about what this is. She held his gaze. Don't thank me yet. Thank me when we've won. He took his hat from the peg by the door, and he paused with his hand on the latch, and she could see the shape of him in the lamplight, the tiredness in his shoulders, and the dignity he carried despite it. There's a letter on the shelf behind the coffee tin, he said. My father wrote it the year before he died. Addressed it to whoever I might one day bring to this house. I never had reason to put it out before. He left. The door closed quietly behind him. Clara stood alone in the middle of the small kitchen that was her kitchen now in this house, that was her house now in this life, that was her life now. She could see the lantern light come on in the barn through the single window. She listened to the prairie night settle into its own rhythms, wind and insects, and the vast open silence of land that did not care about the arrangements of the people living on it. After a long moment, she went to the shelf and reached behind the coffee tin and found the letter. The envelope was worn at the edges from years of sitting in the same place waiting. She turned it over in her hands without opening it. Outside, the lantern in the barn burned steady and quiet, and Clara Holt, who was Clara Calloway now, whether she was ready for that name or not, stood at the kitchen table in the last light of her first evening on this land, and began making the calculations that would determine whether any of them survived what Harold Vance was planning next. She had learned keeping her father's books that the best time to understand a predator's strategy was before he believed his prey was paying attention. Harold Vance thought he had purchased compliance today. He thought he had arranged a tidy trap that would tighten over the next few months until the Calloway land fell into his hands like ripe fruit. He did not know that the woman he had placed inside that trap had spent 3 years watching a man just like him dismantle everything her family had built, and had spent every one of those 3 years figuring out exactly where people like Harold Vance kept their weaknesses. She opened her father's letter and began to read. The letter was not what Clara had expected. She had anticipated something formal, the kind of document a man composed when he wanted to be remembered correctly, full of instructions and warnings, and the particular self-importance of fathers who believed their wisdom was irreplaceable. What she found instead was 2 pages of plain handwriting, unhurried and direct, from a man named Thomas Calloway, who had clearly understood that the land he was leaving his son was both a gift and a burden, and had wanted whoever shared that burden to know it clearly. "If you are reading this," it began, "then my son has found someone worth trusting with this place, which means he has done better than I feared, and exactly as well as I hoped. The land is good. The water is clean and deep, and does not run dry even in the worst summers, which is why men who want things they haven't earned will always find reasons to take an interest in it. Eli knows this. He has known it since he was 12 years old, and watched a man try to buy this property from me for half its value the same week his mother died, when I was too broken to think clearly. I did not sell then. I want whoever reads this to know why." Clara read the rest of it slowly, standing at the table in the lamplight, and by the time she finished, she understood 3 things with the particular clarity that comes from seeing a situation laid out by someone who had lived it before you. Thomas Calloway had known Harold Vance, or known men exactly like Vance, and had built his refusal to sell on a principle rather than a price, which meant there was no number Vance could offer that would legally compel a sale. The land had to be lost through debt or abandonment, which was why Vance had spent years arranging the debt rather than simply increasing his offer. And the deed to the property, according to the letter, contained a specific clause that Thomas Calloway had insisted on inserting in 1861, a clause that Clara suspected Harold Vance either did not know about or had been trying to work around for years. She folded the letter carefully and put it in her dress pocket, and stood very still for a moment, listening to the barn and the night beyond it. Then she went to the shelf and found the deed. She was still reading it when the barn light went out. She slept poorly and briefly on the narrow bed that smelled of cedar and old wood, and she was up before the sky had fully decided to become morning at the table with the deed and every document she had found in the trunk at the foot of the bed by the time she heard Eli's boots on the porch steps. He knocked before he opened his own door, which she noticed. "You're up early," he said. "I didn't sleep much." She looked up from the papers. "Your father was a careful man." Eli came in and hung his hat on the peg and moved to the stove to start the fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it every morning for years. "He was," he said, "more careful than I've been, maybe." "He put a restriction clause in the deed," Clara said. "In the original 1861 filing, the land cannot be sold under foreclosure to any party that holds a commercial banking license in the state of Kansas. It can only be transferred to a private individual buyer or inherited directly." She watched his back. "Does Harold Vance hold a commercial banking license?" Eli's hands went still on the stove grate. He turned around slowly. "He does," he said. "The First Territorial Bank is licensed under his personal name." "Then he cannot legally foreclose and acquire this property through the bank," Clara said. "He can call in the debt. He can force a sale, but he cannot be the buyer." Any foreclosure action he pursues would have to result in a public auction open to any private individual, and he would have to bid through a third party to acquire it, which creates a paper trail and a legal challenge that any competent lawyer could use to contest the transfer. She set the deed down on the table. Your father knew exactly what he was doing. Eli crossed the room in 3 strides and picked up the deed, reading it with the focused intensity of a man seeing something familiar suddenly appear in a different light entirely. Clara watched him read and said nothing, giving him the time to work through it himself. I've had this deed for 4 years, he said, and his voice had gone quiet in the way of someone genuinely unsettled. I never understood what that clause meant. I thought it was some old legal language from the territorial days. It may have been standard language that your father specifically sought out and insisted on, Clara said. Or it may be that he had a reason to include it that was personal and specific. Either way, it changes the shape of what Vance can actually do. She laced her fingers together on the table. It does not mean we are safe. It means that Vance's plan is more complicated than a straightforward foreclosure, which means he needs something else from this situation. Something that the debt consolidation alone cannot give him. What does he need? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. She stood up and moved to where the coffee was warming on the stove. Tell me about James Whitfield. Specifically, what kind of law does he practice? Eli set the deed down. Contract law mostly, some land disputes. He's been back in Abilene about 6 months, like I said, setting up his office on the east side of Main Street. He paused. He's a good man, smart. He left the farm because he couldn't make himself love the work the way I do, but he never pretended otherwise, which I respected. Can you trust him completely? With my life, Eli said without hesitation. Then we need to go see him today. Clara poured 2 cups and set one on the table near him. Not together. I'll go alone. You stay and work the farm, because if Vance has anyone watching this property, which I would assume he does, the last thing we want is both of us riding into town together looking like we're taking action. Eli looked at her. You've been here one night. I've been thinking about Harold Vance for 3 years, she said. I've just had a different name for him. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him recalibrating again, adjusting to the reality of her in a way that seemed genuine rather than performative. Ruth McAllister will come by this morning, he said. She does most mornings when she's not deep in her own work. She's seen Vance maneuver before. She might know things about that deed clause that I don't. Good. Clara drank her coffee. Then we have a plan for the morning. Ruth McAllister arrived at 7:30 on a horse that was better than the one Clara would have expected a widow farmer to keep, which told her something immediately. She was a compact, weathered woman, somewhere in her middle 50s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical knot and sharp eyes that moved over Clara in the doorway with the quick, comprehensive assessment of someone accustomed to reading situations fast. You're the Holt girl, she said. It was not a question. Clara Calloway, Clara said. Come in. Ruth tied her horse to the porch post and came inside, and she looked at the papers spread across the table and then looked at Clara with an expression that shifted from assessment to something that might have been approval. You've been reading the deed, she said, since before dawn. Did you find the restriction clause? Clara went very still. You know about it. Thomas Calloway told me about it the year before he died, Ruth said, pulling out a chair and sitting down with the ease of someone who had sat in this kitchen many times before. He also told me something else that Eli doesn't know, because Thomas didn't want to put that weight on a boy who was already carrying too much. She looked at Clara steadily. But you're not a boy, and from the look of this table, you're not someone who should be kept in the dark. Tell me, Clara said. Thomas didn't include that clause to protect against a hypothetical future banker, Ruth said. He included it to protect against Harold Vance specifically. Vance was operating a lending concern in Abilene as far back as 1858, before he had the formal banking license, and he tried to buy this land from Thomas twice, before Thomas's wife got sick, and once directly after she died. Thomas knew the man's pattern. Buy up debt. Wait for hardship, foreclose when a family is too broken to fight back. She paused. He also knew something else. Something that would make Vance's entire Abilene operation legally questionable if it ever came out in front of a territorial judge. Clara sat down. What did he know? The original loan documents that established Vance's first lending concern in this county were witnessed by a justice of the peace named Aldrich, Ruth said. The same Reverend Aldrich who performed your ceremony yesterday. Aldrich is a justice of the peace as well as a minister. Was, Ruth said. He lost the justice appointment in 1875 when the territorial government reorganized the county courts. But between 1870 and 1875, he witnessed and notarized a significant number of financial documents for Vance's operation, some of which Thomas believed were backdated. She looked at Clara. Thomas never had the resources to prove it. He was one man with a farm and no legal connections. But if someone were to go through the county records with a lawyer who knew what to look for, backdated loan documents would mean the legal foundation of Vance's current banking license is fraudulent, Clara said slowly, which would mean every debt he holds, including the debts on this farm, could be contested. That is what Thomas believed, Ruth said. He couldn't prove it, but the records are still in the county clerk's office because nobody thought to look for a reason to challenge them. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Clara could hear the sounds of the farm beginning its day. Eli moving somewhere near the barn, the particular morning sounds of land that was alive and working. She thought about her Uncle Victor, who had forged her father's signature on loan documents and disappeared. She thought about Harold Vance, who sat in his beautiful office with his portrait on the wall and arranged marriages to consolidate control over a piece of land he had been trying to acquire for 25 years. She thought about Thomas Calloway, who had died knowing that the fight was real and had left his son a deed with a clause and a letter with enough truth in it to arm whoever came after him. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked Ruth directly. "You could have told Eli any time in the past 4 years." Ruth looked at her with those sharp, clear eyes. Eli is a good man and a fine farmer, and he is constitutionally incapable of believing that another person could be as deliberately and systematically corrupt as Harold Vance is, she said. He keeps looking for the misunderstanding. He keeps thinking that if he explains his situation clearly enough, Vance will behave reasonably. He does not have the particular kind of anger that this situation requires. She tilted her head. "You do." Clara met her gaze. "I grew up watching my father refuse to believe that his own brother would betray him until the day he had proof he couldn't deny," she said. "I learned early that some people are exactly as bad as the evidence says they are." "Then we understand each other," Ruth said, and reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded paper. "I have been keeping records for 6 years. Every transaction I've observed Vance conduct in this county. Every property that's changed hands in circumstances that felt wrong, every family that left under financial pressure that seemed to arrive from nowhere. I started writing them down because I thought someday someone would need them." She set the paper on the table. "I think that someday is now." Clara unfolded it and looked at the columns of names and dates and amounts carefully kept in Ruth's precise handwriting. There were 11 properties listed. The Calloway farm was the only one still in its original owner's hands. "He's been building this for a long time," Clara said. "Since before your father came to Abilene," Ruth confirmed. "Long before yours. Your family's debt was not an accident, Clara. Vance's man found your Uncle Victor 18 months ago when your father's store was doing well enough that Vance had no natural leverage. Victor was already running a small con operation in Missouri. Vance gave him better tools and a more valuable target." The words settled into Clara like stones dropped one by one into deep water, each one displacing something else, rearranging the floor of everything she had believed about what had happened to her family. She sat very still and let them settle completely before she spoke. "Vance arranged my uncle's betrayal," she said. "I believe so. I cannot prove it. Not yet. But if James Whitfield can get into those county records, he would need a reason to look, Ruth said. An official reason, something that gives him legal standing to request access to documents that nobody has looked at in years. She paused. A recently married woman who believes that the debt which compelled her marriage may have been constructed fraudulently would have standing to file a formal petition of inquiry, particularly if that petition were supported by a neighboring property owner with a documented history of related concerns. Clara looked at Ruth McAllister across the table and felt something shift in her chest. Not the cold, sharp clarity of strategy, but something warmer and more complicated. The particular feeling of discovering that you are not as alone in a fight as you believed you were. You've been waiting for someone to come to this farm who would do this, Clara said. I've been waiting for someone to come to this farm who could, Ruth said simply. There's a difference. Clara reached across the table and picked up the deed and Ruth's list of properties and the letter from Thomas Calloway, and aligned all three edges with the precision she brought to ledger columns. I'm going to see James Whitfield this morning, she said, alone as I said to Eli. Eli works the farm and appears unconcerned because the one advantage we have right now is that Vance believes this marriage made us easier to manage, and we cannot give that up before we're ready. She stood. Will you come with me to Whitfield's office, or would that draw too much attention? I'll come, Ruth said. I've been a visible presence in Vance's way for years. One more trip to town won't surprise anyone. She stood as well, and she was shorter than Clara had registered when she was sitting, but the quality of stillness she carried made her seem larger than her physical size in the same way a deeply rooted fence post seems larger than its measurements. Eli is going to be angry when he understands the full shape of what Vance did to your family, she added. Let him be angry, Clara said. Anger is useful if it goes in the right direction. She found Eli at the fence line at the eastern edge of the near pasture, replacing a post that had been leaning since the last hard rain. He worked with the focused economy of someone who had been doing this long enough that his body knew the job, and his mind could be somewhere else entirely, and she suspected his mind was elsewhere, because he looked up before she was close enough that he should have heard her, which meant he had been listening for her. I'm going to town, she said. He set down the post maul. With Ruth. She's coming with me. We're going to see James Whitfield. He looked at her steadily. The morning sun was behind her, and she could see his face clearly, and the expression on it was complicated, in a way she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. Several things occupying the same space at the same time, without any of them fully resolving. What did Ruth tell you? He asked. Quite a lot. About Vance. About Vance. About your father. About this land. She held his gaze. She told me things you should have been told 4 years ago, and I'm sorry that you weren't, and when I come back this evening, I'll tell you all of it. But right now, I need you to trust me enough to let me go do this without a full accounting of every step first. Eli was quiet for a long moment. A hawk moved in a slow circle above the far tree line, and the morning wind moved through the grass between them, and he looked at her with those dark, careful eyes that she was learning to read, or beginning to learn, which was not the same thing. I trust you, he said. The simplicity of it caught her off guard. Not, I suppose so, or I'll have to, or any of the qualified versions she had expected. Just 2 words flat and direct, stated as established fact. You barely know me, she said. I know you read a 20-year-old deed clause by lamplight on your first night in a stranger's house and understood its legal implications before breakfast, he said. And I know that Vance expected you to make me easier to control, and you walked through his door and immediately started doing the opposite. A pause. That's enough. Clara looked at him for a moment, and something in her chest did a thing she did not yet have a name for, and did not particularly want to examine in the middle of a fence-line conversation. She turned back toward the house and Ruth's waiting horse. I'll be back before dark, she said. Don't do anything visible while I'm gone. I'll be fixing fence, he said. Same as always. She was 20 feet away when he called after her. Clara. She stopped. My father's letter, he said. Did you read it? Yes. A pause. What did you think of him? She turned enough to see him over her shoulder. I think he was a man who knew the fight was real and prepared for it the best he could, she said. And I think he would be glad someone finally picked up what he left. She did not wait to see his expression, but she heard him pick up the post maul again, and the sound of it driving cleanly into the earth followed her all the way back to the house, steady and purposeful and certain. James Whitfield's office was the kind of place that told you everything about the man before he opened his mouth. It was small and overfull, with papers stacked in columns that looked chaotic, but were clearly organized by a system only he understood, and the single window faced east, so the morning light came in clean and direct, rather than the warm, flattering angle that most men preferred for receiving clients. He had chosen a working light over a flattering one, which Clara noted. He was younger than she had expected, maybe 30, with the kind of face that would have been comfortable on a farm, but had been pointed in a different direction by some combination of circumstance and will. He stood up when they came in, which was habit rather than performance, and he looked at Clara with the quick calibrating attention of someone accustomed to walking into situations with incomplete information. Mrs. Calloway, he said. Ruth. He gestured to the 2 chairs across from his desk. I heard about the wedding yesterday. I was going to ride out to see Eli this week. I saved you the trip, Clara said, sitting down. And I need you to set aside whatever you think you know about why I'm here, because I suspect your assumptions are wrong. Whitfield looked at Ruth, who gave him nothing, and then looked back at Clara. He sat down slowly. All right, he said. Tell me. She told him everything. She laid it out in the order she had assembled it over the past 18 hours, beginning with the structure of her family's debt and her conviction that Victor Holt had not acted alone, moving through the deed restriction clause and what it meant for Vance's legal options, and arriving finally at Ruth's records and the question of the backdated loan documents witnessed by Aldrich between 1870 and 1875. She spoke without stopping and without softening, because she had learned from 3 years of keeping books that a clear accounting was more useful than a comfortable one, and she watched Whitfield's face as she spoke the way she had learned to watch faces when she was presenting numbers that people did not want to hear. He was very still by the time she finished, the kind of stillness that meant a mind was moving fast. The county records from that period are held in the clerk's office on the 2nd floor of the courthouse, he said. They're public documents. Anyone can request access. But anyone walking in to request those specific documents would be visible, Clara said. Vance has someone in that office, or near it. He has someone in most places, Ruth confirmed. If we request those records directly, he knows we're looking before we find anything, Clara continued. We need another way in. She paused. Or we need him to believe we're looking somewhere else entirely while we look there. Whitfield leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of someone running through a problem from multiple angles simultaneously. There's a standard property title review that any party can request ahead of a land sale or transfer, he said slowly. It requires the clerk to pull all associated documents for a property, including historical loan records that were filed against it. It's routine, unglamorous paperwork. Nobody pays attention to it because it happens every time land changes hands. Who can initiate a title review? Clara asked. Any party with a demonstrated interest in the property. He looked at her. A new spouse would qualify. If you filed a routine title review on the Calloway property as part of establishing your legal interest in the land following marriage, it would require the clerk to pull every document associated with that title going back to the original filing, including the 1861 deed with the restriction clause, Clara said, including that. And if Aldrich's notarizations appear in the associated loan documents from that period, they'd be pulled as part of the same review. He paused. It would look like a new wife doing paperwork, which is exactly what it would be. How long would the review take? 3 days if I file it today. The clerk is required by territorial law to complete the pull within 72 hours of a formal request. Clara looked at Ruth, who gave a small nod. File it today, Clara said. As early as possible. I'll sign whatever you need me to sign. Whitfield was already pulling paper from the nearest stack, and Clara could see in his movements the particular energy of someone who had been waiting for a reason to do something and had just been given it. There's something else, he said, not looking up from what he was writing. You said Vance arranged this marriage thinking it would make Eli easier to manage. That means Vance believes the marriage gives him something, not just a more burdened debtor. He looked up. What does he actually gain from you being in that house? The question sat in the air. Clara had been turning it over since Ruth had first articulated it that morning, and she had an answer she did not entirely like. A witness, she said. If Eli defaults on the debt, and Vance moves to foreclose, a contested foreclosure is cleaner when there's a second adult in the household who can be presented as having had fair warning. It removes the argument that Eli was isolated and pressured without adequate representation. It also, Ruth said, gives Vance a second party to approach separately. If the marriage is troubled, if the wife can be persuaded or frightened into signing something or testifying to something that works against the husband's claim on the land. He thought he was putting someone inside the house he could use, Clara said. The understanding settled over her cold and clear. He arranged the marriage through my father's debt because he believed a woman in that position would be frightened and compliant and potentially useful as a lever against Eli. She looked at Whitfield. He did not know anything about me specifically. He knew you were George Holt's daughter, Whitfield said carefully. He knew my father was a man he could push around, Clara said. He assumed the daughter was the same. The three of them sat with that for a moment, and in the silence, Clara felt the particular cold fury that had been living in her chest since the morning her father told her what was happening, crystallize into something harder and more useful than anger. She was done being a piece on Harold Vance's board. The only question was how to make that cost him something real. File the review, she said to Whitfield, and say nothing to anyone about what we're specifically looking for. If anyone asks, it's routine title work for a new marriage. She stood. When can I come back to see what you found? 3 days, he said. Maybe 2, if the clerk is cooperative. He stood as well and looked at her with an expression she recognized the one people wore when they were recalibrating their understanding of a situation they thought they had already assessed. Mrs. Calloway, I've known Eli Calloway since we were both 12 years old. He is one of the finest men I have ever known, and I have been watching Vance tighten a noose around him for 2 years without being able to do a thing about it because I didn't have the standing or the evidence. He paused. I'm glad you're here. Thank you, Clara said. Keep the originals of everything you find somewhere other than this office. He looked at her sharply. You think he'd... I think a man who arranged a marriage to consolidate control over a land dispute is not going to be careless when he realizes someone is looking at his documents, Clara said. Keep copies somewhere he can't reach. She and Ruth rode back out of town the way they had come, in keeping to an easy pace that looked like nothing more than a widow and a farmer's wife returning from a morning errand. The sky was clear and wide over the Kansas land, and the road was dry and straight, and Ruth rode with the easy authority of someone who had covered this ground in every kind of weather and was not impressed by any of it. He'll move faster than 3 days if he suspects something, Ruth said when they were far enough from town. He'll move faster regardless, Clara said. Vance doesn't sit still. He's been working this plan for years, and he's accustomed to being the one who sets the timeline. She kept her eyes on the road ahead. Which is why we do not wait for him to move. We make him react to us. How? He put me in that house because he thought I'd be useful to him. Let's give him something that looks like confirmation of that. She turned to look at Ruth. Does Vance have anyone he trusts to carry social information? Someone who talks to the farm wives, visits households, passes things along? Ruth's expression shifted with recognition. Margaret Pryor. She runs the dry goods counter at the general store, and she has never in her life allowed a piece of information to sit unshared for longer than 24 hours. She is not Vance's creature deliberately, she simply cannot help herself. Then I need to visit the general store tomorrow morning, and I need to look like a woman who is uncertain about the situation she has walked into, Clara said. Uncertain enough to mention in passing that her new husband seems troubled about the property, and she doesn't fully understand the financial arrangements, but it seems complicated. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You want Vance to think you're confused, and potentially sympathetic. I want Vance to think I'm exactly the compliant, frightened woman he assumed he was placing in that house, Clara said. I want him to feel comfortable. Comfortable men make decisions based on what they expect rather than what is actually happening. Ruth looked at her sidelong with an expression that was as close to warmth as her weathered face seemed to allow. Thomas Calloway would have liked you very much, she said. I hope so, Clara said. I intend to finish what he started. Eli was still at the fence line when they returned, though he had moved further north and was working on a different section than when she had left. He saw them coming and set down his tools and walked to meet them at the gate. And Clara could see in the way he walked the particular tension of a man who had been working with his hands while his mind was somewhere else entirely for the better part of a morning. Ruth took her leave with a directness that Clara was coming to appreciate as fundamental to her character, a brief exchange with Eli about a fence post issue on the shared property line. And then she was gone, leaving the two of them standing at the gate in the afternoon quiet. Tell me, Eli said. She told him. She told him about Aldrich and the backdated documents, and Whitfield's title review, and she watched him absorb it with the same focused working stillness she had seen at the table on their first night. But when she told him about Victor Holt and what Ruth believed Vance had arranged with her uncle, she saw something change in his face that was different from everything else, a tightening around his jaw and eyes that was not anger at an abstract wrong, but something more personal and more protective. He arranged what happened to your family, Eli said. It was not quite a question. Ruth believes so. We can't prove it yet. But you believe it. Yes, Clara said simply. Eli looked away from her toward the middle distance, and she could see him working through something internal, some recalibration of what the situation was and what it required. When he looked back, his expression was settled in a new way, harder at the edges, but clearer in the center. What do you need from me for the next 3 days? He said. The question was so clean and practical that it momentarily disarmed her. She had been prepared for protest for the masculine insistence on doing something immediate and visible for the argument that he should be the one going to town and confronting Vance directly. She had not been prepared for simply, what do you need? I need you to be exactly what you appear to be, she said. A man working his farm and managing a new marriage and showing no signs of anything except the ordinary stress of someone in debt trying to make it through harvest season. No trips to town that aren't necessary. No visible communication with Whitfield. Nothing that suggests we know what we know. And the morning, tomorrow morning I'm going to the general store in town to plant something for Margaret Pryor to carry back to Vance. She explained the logic of it briefly and watched him listen without interruption, which she was noticing was a consistent quality in him, the ability to hear something through to its end before forming a response. Most men she had known could not do that. You're going to perform being uncertain and frightened, he said when she finished, not judgmentally, just clarifying. Yes. That's going to be uncomfortable for you. She looked at him. Why do you say that? He almost smiled, just at the corner of his mouth, brief and real. Because uncertain and frightened are not two words I would naturally attach to you, and performing something you're not is always uncomfortable. He paused. But you'll do it well, because you are also precise, and you understand what's needed. Clara regarded him for a moment. You're a more perceptive man than you let on, Eli Calloway. Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation for being straightforward. But straightforward and perceptive are not mutually exclusive. Most people think they are, he said. She left him to finish the fence line and went back inside to begin the calculation she had been building in the back of her mind since the conversation with Whitfield that morning. She sat at the table with a blank page from the ledger book and began mapping it out, not in numbers, but in connections, the relationships between properties and debts and documents and people that constituted the actual architecture of what Vance had built over 25 years. It was slower work than number keeping, more like building something than recording something, and she lost track of time in it the way she used to lose track of time in the books when a discrepancy finally began to resolve. She heard Eli come in as the light was changing toward evening. Heard him move through the familiar sounds of end-of-day farm work, washing up at the basin, starting the stove fire, with the confident economy of long habit. He did not interrupt her, and she did not look up, and there was something in that mutual unspoken understanding of each other's concentration that felt like the beginning of a language they were learning together. "There are beans from this morning," she said without looking up from the page, "and the rest of the cornbread." "I can cook," he said. "I know you can. I'm busy." She heard him begin moving around the kitchen with the same quiet efficiency she had observed the night before, and the domestic sound of it, the ordinary human sound of someone preparing food, in the same room where she was working, settled around her in a way she had not expected and did not examine too closely. They ate late when the dark outside the window had fully arrived, and the lamp was the whole world, and Clara turned her page face down on the table because some of what was on it was not ready to be explained yet, and she was not certain how to explain the parts that were. "My father's letter," Eli said, when they had been eating in silence long enough that speaking felt natural rather than intrusive. "You said he left things to arm whoever came after him." "Yes. He never told me about the clause directly." He turned his cup in his hands. "I've thought about that today while I was working. Why he wouldn't tell me. Ruth's theory is that he didn't want to put that weight on a young man who was already carrying too much." "Maybe." He was quiet for a moment. "Or maybe he knew I would have gone at Vance directly, and that would have been exactly the wrong move." He looked up. "I would have. If I'd known at 22 that Vance had a specific legal barrier to acquiring this land, I would have walked into his office and told him I knew, thinking that would settle it. And instead of settling it, it would have told him that someone had found the clause and was aware of the problem," Clara said, "and given him time to find a workaround before you had anything to fight back with." "Yes." A pause. "My father knew me well enough to know that." Clara looked at him across the table. "He trusted that eventually the right person would come to this house and find what he left," she said, "and choose to use it at the right time." Eli held her gaze. "He trusted better than he knew," he said quietly. The words settled between them in the lamplight, and Clara felt that unnamed thing in her chest again, the thing she had been declining to examine since the fence line, and this time she let herself acknowledge that it was there before she set it aside with the practical deliberateness of someone who had too much on their mind to add another item to the list. "Get some sleep," she said. "Tomorrow I have to go into town and convince Margaret Pryor that I'm a confused woman in over her head, and I need to be convincing enough that she doesn't think twice before she goes straight to Vance with what I tell her." "What will you tell her?" "Enough of the truth to make the lie believable," Clara said. "That's always the most convincing kind." She cleared the dishes, and he banked the stove fire, and they moved around each other in the small kitchen with the same unspoken coordination they had managed the night before. And when he took his blankets to the floor, she lay in the dark above him and stared at the ceiling, and listened to the prairie night, and thought about Harold Vance sitting in his beautiful office with his portrait on the wall, satisfied with the elegant trap he believed he had set. 3 days, she thought. 3 days, and they would know what was in those county records. 3 days, and they would know whether Thomas Calloway's careful preparation had left them anything solid enough to stand on. She pressed her hand flat against the wall in the dark, feeling the solid resistance of stone and wood, the particular unmistakable substance of something built to last by a man who knew what he was up against. Outside, the wind moved through the Kansas grass in its endless way, and the farm sat quiet on top of the best aquifer in the county, and in his office in Abilene, Harold Vance was almost certainly sleeping soundly. which was Clara thought about to become his most significant mistake. Margaret Pryor was exactly what Ruth had described, a woman constructed almost entirely of social information who received it and dispensed it with the dedicated efficiency of someone who had found her life's true vocation. She was behind the dry goods counter when Clara came in the next morning, and she looked up with the particular brightness of someone who has been waiting consciously or not for something interesting to happen. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, and the name carried the slight emphasis of someone tasting a new word. "I heard about the wedding. How are you settling in?" "I'm managing," Clara said, and she let just enough uncertainty into her voice to be readable without being theatrical. She moved to the counter and looked at the bolts of fabric with the distracted attention of a woman whose mind was somewhere else. "It's a great deal to take in all at once." "I imagine so." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "The Calloway place is a fine piece of land, though I understand there have been some financial difficulties." "There have been," Clara said. She picked up a length of cotton and set it down again. "I don't fully understand all of it, honestly. The debt arrangements seem very complicated. Eli doesn't explain things in much detail." She paused, and she made her next words come out with the careful hesitation of a woman choosing how much to reveal to a relative stranger. "Mr. Vance has been very patient with us, I think. Eli seems to feel the pressure of it, but Mr. Vance seems like a reasonable man." She could feel Margaret Pryor absorbing every syllable like dry ground absorbing rain. "Mr. Vance is very involved in the financial affairs of this county," Margaret said, with the authority of someone confirming something universally acknowledged. "Yes, he mentioned that he's been very accommodating with the existing loans," Clara said. "I suppose I trust that it will work out. Eli is a hard worker. I just hope the harvest is enough to satisfy everyone concerned." She let a small, worried breath escape. "I wouldn't want any surprises." She bought a spool of thread she did not need and left. She was back at the farm before noon, and she went directly to the kitchen table and the page she had turned face down the night before and continued the work she had been building. She had the structure of it mostly assembled now, and what she was doing was checking it against itself the way she checked ledger columns looking for the place where the numbers did not balance the entry that had been hidden inside a legitimate transaction. Eli came in at midday and stood behind her chair and looked at the page without speaking for a moment. She had learned already that this was how he read something standing rather than sitting, as though he needed to be ready to move at whatever the information required. "You've mapped the whole thing," he said. "Most of it." She pointed to a section near the bottom of the page. "This is where I'm not certain. Vance holds your consolidated debt, but the original notes were issued by 3 different lenders. When he bought them up, he would have needed to file transfer documents with the county clerk. Those transfers should be in the same records Whitfield is pulling. And if the original notes were connected to Aldrich's notarizations, then the chain of ownership on your debt goes through documents that may be fraudulent at the foundation," Clara said, "which means the debt itself may not be legally enforceable." She paused. "I want to be careful with that. It's a possible conclusion, not a certain one. I've been wrong before by moving too fast from what I can see to what I want to be true." Eli pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, which was not his usual posture during these conversations. He sat close enough that she could see the paper clearly from his angle, and she was aware of the proximity in the way she had been consistently aware of him since the first morning, a peripheral attention that she kept peripheral by main force. "My father used to say that the most dangerous moment in any fight is when you think you've won before you have," he said. "He was right about most things from what I can tell." "He was." A pause. "Clara, if Whitfield finds what we think he'll find, what happens next? Legally, I mean. What does it actually give us?" It was the right question, and she had been working toward an answer that was honest rather than reassuring. "At minimum grounds to contest any foreclosure action Vance attempts," she said. A formal challenge filed with the territorial court would freeze any transfer of the property while the challenge is reviewed. That could take months. During those months, Vance cannot legally acquire the land, and the nature of the challenge would become public record. Which means it becomes visible. Which means other people who owe Vance money and have wondered about the legal foundations of those loans might start asking their own questions, Clara said. Ruth has records on 11 properties. If even 3 or 4 of those families file similar challenges based on questions about Aldrich's notarizations, Vance's entire operation becomes the subject of a territorial inquiry. Eli was quiet, working through it. And if Whitfield finds nothing if the documents are clean, then we look harder at what else might be wrong with them. She looked at him directly. I don't believe they're clean, Eli. A man who arranged what Vance arranged with your father, and then with my family, does not do that alongside clean business practices. The corruption is systemic. It goes all the way down. I just need the piece of it that's provable. He held her gaze. You've been certain from the beginning. I've been building toward certainty, she said. There's a difference. Being certain before you have evidence is how people like my father get destroyed. Being certain after you've assembled the evidence is how you win. He nodded slowly. Then he said, What did you tell Margaret Pryor this morning? She told him precisely and without softening, and watched him absorb the knowledge that she had spent the morning performing confusion and gratitude toward Harold Vance. He was very still while she spoke, and when she finished, he looked at the table for a moment before he looked back at her. You're protecting us by making him comfortable, he said, by giving him no reason to accelerate. Yes. But you don't know if it worked. I'll know when something happens, Clara said. If Vance believes what Margaret carries to him, he'll do nothing in the short term. He'll sit on it, feel secure, let the harvest season approach without making a move, because he believes he has a compliant woman in the house who is already framing him as patient and reasonable. If he doesn't believe it, or if he suspects something is happening with the county records, he'll move fast. She paused. We'll know which one it is within 48 hours. She was right, but not in the way she had anticipated. The second day passed without incident, and the third morning came clear and cold, with the particular quality of early fall on the Kansas prairie, the kind of morning that made the whole season feel like a held breath. Clara was at the table before full light with her page and her thoughts when she heard a horse on the road, moving at a pace that was purposeful rather than casual. She was at the window before she had decided to stand up. The rider was not from Vance's office. She recognized James Whitfield, by his posture, even at distance upright, and slightly forward, the seat of a man in a hurry, who has been trained to look controlled. He came through the gate without stopping and tied his horse at the porch post, and was at the door with his knuckles raised to knock before she had crossed the room. She opened the door. His face told her everything before he spoke, and what it told her was complicated. Not the clean victory expression she had been hoping for, but something more layered, equal parts discovery and new problem. I need Eli, he said. He's in the barn. I'll get him. Come inside. She went to the barn and found Eli already moving toward the door, because he had heard the horse too and had learned in 3 days to read the sound of fast movement the way he read weather. He came inside, and Whitfield was standing at the table with his hat in his hands and a folder of papers in front of him, and he looked at them both with the expression of a man who has found what he went looking for and discovered it is both better and worse than he expected. Sit down, Clara said. Both of you. They sat. She remained standing, because she found she thought more clearly on her feet when something important was about to be said. The Aldrich notarizations. Whitfield began opening the folder. Between 1870 and 1875, Aldrich witnessed and notarized 47 financial documents for Vance's lending concern. 31 of those documents involve property in this county, including the 3 original notes on your farm, Eli, which were issued between 1878 and 1880. But Aldrich lost his justice appointment in 1875, Clara said. The notes on Eli's farm were issued after that. Yes. Whitfield looked at her. After he lost the appointment. The notarizations on those three documents are dated 1878 and 1879, and they carry Aldrich's seal from his justice appointment, which should have been void by then. The room was very quiet. He was still using an expired seal, Eli said. His voice was flat and careful. For at least 4 years after the appointment lapsed, Whitfield said. I found 6 documents total with post-1875 dates carrying Aldrich's justice seal. All 6 are associated with Vance's lending operation. All 6 involve properties that Vance subsequently acquired or attempted to acquire. That's not carelessness, Clara said. A man doesn't accidentally use an expired seal 4 years after its expiration on documents associated with a single business partner. That's an ongoing arrangement. No reasonable interpretation makes it accidental, Whitfield agreed. Which means every loan document Vance issued using Aldrich's expired notarizations is legally void. The loans were not properly executed under territorial law. He paused. Including the 3 notes on this property. Eli leaned forward with both forearms on the table. Say that plainly, James. The debt Vance consolidated and is threatening to call in may not be legally enforceable, Whitfield said. The original documents that created the debt were improperly notarized. Any court reviewing them would have grounds to void them entirely. He looked at Clara. You were right about the foundation. How solid is this? Clara asked immediately. Not in the best possible reading, in the honest one. Whitfield respected the distinction. Solid enough to file a formal challenge and expect it to survive an initial review, he said. Whether it survives a full hearing depends on whether Vance can argue that the expired seal was an administrative error rather than deliberate fraud, and whether Aldrich cooperates with his account or contradicts it. He paused. Aldrich is not a strong man. He does what powerful people tell him to do, which is how he ended up in this situation. If Vance tells him to claim error, he'll claim error, if someone else reaches him first. He might say something different, Clara said. He might say the truth, Whitfield said carefully, if he believed that telling it would protect him better than the lie. Clara looked at Eli. He was looking back at her with that working expression, the one where several things occupied the same space simultaneously. Aldrich performed our ceremony, he said. Yes, Clara said. He's been Vance's instrument for years. He knows what the documents mean and what was done with them. Yes. And if someone went to him before Vance does, before word gets back to Vance that the records have been reviewed, then we might have his account before Vance has the opportunity to manage it, Clara said. She looked at Whitfield. Does Vance know you pulled the records? The clerk is not one of his people, Whitfield said. But the clerk talks to people who might be. I would estimate we have 24 hours before it reaches Vance through ordinary social channels. Perhaps less. 24 hours. Clara had run numbers under time pressure before, had balanced books at the end of months, when every figure had to reconcile before the next day's business began, and she knew the specific quality of clarity that came when the window was defined and the options were finite. Then we don't have time to be cautious, she said. We need to go to Aldrich today, this morning before noon if possible. I'll come with you, Eli said. No. She turned to him and held his gaze. Whitfield and I go to Aldrich. You go to Ruth McAllister and you tell her what we found. Tell her we have the documents and we have evidence of the expired seal, and tell her that the families on her list need to know that the legal foundations of their loans may be the same. Not to act yet, just to know. Why Ruth first? Eli asked. Because if this moves to a formal challenge in the territorial court, we need more than one property in the filing, Clara said. A single challenge from one farmer looks like a disgruntled debtor. 6 challenges from 6 different families with the same underlying documentation problem looks like systemic fraud. The territorial court cannot ignore the second. She paused. Your job right now is to build the second. Eli stood up. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she had learned to recognize as the completion of an internal process rather than hesitation. Then he picked up his hat from the table and looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. "You thought through the full shape of this last night," he said. It was not an accusation. It was something closer to wonder. "I thought through several possible shapes," she said. "This is the one that fits." He held her gaze for a beat longer than the conversation required, and she let him, because she understood that what he was doing was not hesitation, but acknowledgement, the wordless equivalent of something that would have taken more time to say properly than they currently had. "Be careful with Aldrich," he said finally. "He's weak, which means he's unpredictable when he's frightened." "I know how to talk to frightened people," Clara said. She and Whitfield rode into Abilene with the particular economy of movement that comes from two people who understand the same urgency and do not need to discuss it. Whitfield carried the folder of documents inside his coat. Clara carried the specific quality of attention she brought to situations where the outcome depended entirely on reading another person correctly. Reverend Aldrich's house sat behind the church, a small, careful house that matched its owner neat, in a way that suggested anxiety rather than pride. He answered the door himself, which meant he did not have help, and when he saw Whitfield, his face did the thing that guilty faces do, a quick internal reorganization that tried to arrive at neutral and missed. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I wasn't expecting—" "May we come in, Reverend?" Whitfield said, and his voice was professionally pleasant in the way that lawyers learn to be pleasant, while making clear that the pleasantness was not the primary communication. They went in. Aldrich's sitting room was the room of a man who lived carefully inside a small space. Everything in order, nothing excessive, a life arranged to draw as little attention as possible. He was in his 60s, Clara estimated, with the slightly collapsed posture of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had stopped standing up straight under it. Clara sat down across from him, and she looked at him with the direct, neutral attention she used when she was reviewing accounts that she already knew contained a problem, the attention that said she was not angry, not threatening, simply interested in the accurate version of what had happened. "Reverend Aldrich," she said, "I'm Clara Calloway. You performed my marriage ceremony 3 days ago." "Yes, of course." He looked at her, and then at Whitfield, and then back at her, and she could see him trying to determine what version of the next few minutes would serve him best. "Is something wrong with the documents?" "Nothing with those documents," she said. "I want to talk to you about some other ones." She nodded to Whitfield, who opened the folder and set 3 pages on the table between them. "These are loan documents that Mr. Vance issued in 1878 and 1879, notarized with your seal as Justice of the Peace. You lost that appointment in 1875. Aldrich looked at the papers the way a man looks at something he has been hoping would never appear in front of him. His hands resting on his knees went very still. "I want to give you the opportunity to tell me what happened," Clara said, "before anyone else asks you that question. Because someone else will ask it, and soon, and the version you tell first is the one that will matter most to the territorial court when this goes in front of a judge." She paused. "The question is whether you want the first version to be one you've chosen, or one that Vance has told you to say." Aldrich's eyes came up from the documents and found her face, and she could see the calculation happening behind them, the rapid, desperate arithmetic of a man assessing which danger was immediate and which was theoretical. "Mr. Vance has been very good to this congregation," he said, but his voice had the quality of a phrase spoken from memory rather than belief. "Mr. Vance has been using you for 15 years, Clara said without heat. "He gave you small benefits, and in exchange, you provided him with the appearance of legal legitimacy on documents that were not legally sound. I don't think you understood at the beginning how far it would go. I think by the time you understood, you were already too involved to see a way out." She watched him. "I'm offering you a way out." The sitting room was very quiet. Whitfield sat to her left and said nothing, which was the correct thing to do, and she was glad he understood that. "What kind of way out?" Aldrich said, and his voice was smaller now. The voice of a man who has been carrying something alone for a long time, and is being offered the chance to set it down. A written account of when and how Vance asked you to use the expired seal filed with Whitfield as your legal representative before the end of today, Clara said. In exchange, Whitfield files your account as a cooperating witness rather than a named defendant. The court's interest is in Vance's operation, not in the man he used to run it. She paused. But the account has to be complete and it has to be true. I will know if it isn't because I have the documents, and I will read whatever you give Whitfield against them line by line. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze steadily, not unkindly, because she genuinely did not feel unkind toward him. She felt the particular clear-eyed patience of someone who understood exactly how a person arrived at the place where they were doing wrong things to survive, and had learned to measure that separately from the fact that the wrong things had caused real damage. Vance came to me in the spring of 1878, Aldrich said. His voice had changed completely, the formal, careful tone gone, replaced by something that sounded like relief, mixed with the grief of a thing finally said. He told me the seal was still valid, that there had been an administrative delay in the formal recording of the appointment change, that I was legally covered through the following year. I believed him. Or... He stopped and looked at the floor. I chose to believe him, which is not the same thing. No, Clara said quietly. It is not. The second time in 1879 I knew. He told me it was a small technicality, that the loans were legitimate and the seal was a formality. He said that if I raised the issue, he would make sure it came out that I had been knowingly using the expired seal from the beginning rather than having been misled. He looked up. He had me either way. That was how he worked. I know, Clara said. Write it down exactly as you just told me. Every detail, every date you can remember, every communication with Vance about those documents. Whitfield will take your statement formally this afternoon. She stood up, and Whitfield gathered the papers back into the folder, and she looked down at Aldrich one more time. He looked older than he had when they came in, which was not a bad thing, she thought. Carrying lies required a kind of sustained tension that looked like youth from a distance, but aged you from the inside. Setting them down sometimes let a person breathe for the first time in years. Reverend, she said, my marriage ceremony. The words you said. She paused. Those were real, whatever else was happening around them. I want you to know that. He looked at her with something that was not quite absolution and not quite gratitude, but lived somewhere between them. God bless you, Mrs. Calloway, he said. She left Whitfield to take the formal statement and rode back toward the farm alone through the October morning, and she did not ride slowly. Somewhere behind her in Abilene, Harold Vance was beginning his day with the comfortable confidence of a man who believed his position was secured. Somewhere in his office, he might already have heard from Margaret Pryor, might already be sitting with the pleasant assurance that the woman placed in the Calloway house was confused and grateful and not worth worrying about. She had perhaps 8 hours before something she could not predict disrupted that confidence. 8 hours before Aldrich's statement was filed, before the title review was formally completed, before the first of Ruth McAllister's 11 families began asking questions about their own loan documents. 8 hours of Vance's comfortable certainty that everything was proceeding exactly as he had arranged it. She pressed her heels into the horse's sides and rode harder, because 8 hours was enough, but only if she and Eli used every minute of them correctly. And she had one more thing to do before Vance understood that the piece he had placed inside the Calloway house had been from the very first morning facing the wrong direction entirely. Eli was waiting at the gate when she rode in, which told her that Ruth had already come and gone, and that whatever had passed between them had left him with the particular coiled stillness of a man who had received important information and was holding it carefully while he waited for the rest. She dismounted, and he took the horse without being asked, and she followed him to the barn, because the conversation that needed to happen was not one for open ground where distance could dilute it. Ruth came, he said, securing the horse with quick, practiced movements. I know. What did she say? That 4 of the 11 families on her list are willing to file alongside us. 2 more are uncertain but leaning toward it. The remaining 5 are too frightened of Vance to move without more assurance than we can currently give them." He turned to face her. "She also said that Ben Hooper, who owns the feed store on the west side of Maine, saw a rider leave Vance's office about an hour ago, heading south on the Caldwell Road." Clara went still. "South toward what?" "Toward the county seat," Eli said. "Where the territorial land office is." She understood it immediately and completely, the way a ledger column resolved when the final number was entered, and the whole shape of the discrepancy became visible at once. "He knows," she said. "Or he suspects. He's not waiting for the title review to complete. He's sending someone to file a preemptive transfer document at the land office before any challenge can be formally recorded." "Can he do that?" "If he files a claim of default and initiates a transfer action before Whitfield's challenge is entered into the court record, it creates a competing filing," Clara said. "A territorial judge would have to sort out priority, and Vance's lawyers are better funded than ours." She was already moving toward the barn door. "How long is the ride to the county seat?" 3 hours, maybe 2.5 on a fast horse. Whitfield is still with Aldrich taking the statement. When he's done, he needs to ride to the county seat tonight, not tomorrow tonight, and file the challenge before Vance's man can enter a transfer claim in the morning. She turned to look at Eli directly. "Can you get to Whitfield faster than sending a message?" "I can be in town in 40 minutes if I ride hard." "Then go. Tell him everything I just told you. Tell him Aldrich gave his statement, and the statement needs to be part of the filing, not a separate submission. Tell him the challenge has to be recorded today, the same day the title review completes, because that's the only way to establish clear priority." She held his gaze. "Eli, he has to leave tonight. Not at first light. Tonight." Eli took his hat from the post where he'd hung it and settled it on his head with a single clean motion, and he looked at her in the dim barn light with an expression that had nothing performed in it, nothing held back or carefully managed, just the direct, unguarded face of a man who was no longer recalibrating. "When I get back," he said, "there are things I want to say to you." "Say them when you get back," she said. "Right now, go." He went. She heard the horse leave at a full run, the sound of it cutting across the open land and fading toward town, and she stood alone in the barn for a moment in the sudden quiet, and let herself feel the full weight of what the next several hours contained, all the ways it could resolve, and all the ways it could fail. And then she set that down and went back to the house, because there was one more piece, and it was hers to handle alone. She sat at the table, and she wrote 2 letters. The first was to her father, not long and not warm, but honest in the specific way she had decided she wanted to be honest with him, which was completely and without the softening that would have made it easier for him to read, but less true. She told him what had happened in the past 4 days. She told him about Vance and Victor and the arrangement that had been made behind the debt that had destroyed their family. She told him that it had not been his failure of judgment that had caused it, but a deliberate act by a man who chose his targets carefully, and that knowing this did not absolve him of the choices he had made in response, but that she wanted him to have the accurate version of what had been done to him, rather than the version where he was simply a weak man who had destroyed his own family through foolishness. She sealed it and set it aside. The second letter was harder. She sat with the blank page for several minutes before she wrote, because she was precise about language, and what she was trying to say had more than one layer, and she needed all of them to be accurate. She wrote to her father again, but this one was different. This one asked him to come to Abilene when he was able, not urgently, not as a summons, but as an invitation from a woman who had not yet decided the full extent of what forgiveness looked like in practice, but was willing to find out in person rather than from a distance. She sealed that one too, and put both of them by the door. The afternoon moved the way long afternoons move, when the outcome of something important is being determined somewhere you cannot see or affect slowly, and with the particular texture of time that feels both endless and insufficient. Clara worked. She went through the remaining documents in the trunk, organizing them by date, and type building the clearest possible paper record of the Calloway farm's legal history so that Whitfield would have everything he needed in one place if the territorial court required additional documentation. She found 3 more letters from Thomas Calloway, not addressed to anyone in particular, just a man writing down what he observed and knew, and she read them all and added them to the organized pile because a court that was trying to understand 25 years of a man's deliberate predation needed to hear from the people who had watched it happen. The sun was going down when she heard a horse, and she was at the door before it fully stopped, but it was not Eli's horse, and it was not Eli's rider. It was Ruth McAllister riding with the urgency that Clara had come to understand meant real news rather than courtesy. "Vance came to my property this afternoon," Ruth said, dismounting before the horse had fully stilled. "About an hour after Eli left for town. He came himself, not a man himself, which he has never done before." Clara held the door open. "Come in. Tell me exactly what he said." Ruth came inside and stood at the table rather than sitting, because she too was a woman who thought better on her feet when it mattered. "He was pleasant," she said, and her tone on the word pleasant made it sound like a description of something dangerous. "He said he had heard there was some question about property documentation in the county, and he wanted to assure me personally that any concerns I had about my own title would be addressed generously and privately, without the need for any formal legal proceedings." She looked at Clara. "He offered to buy my property at twice its assessed value, effective immediately, if I would sign a simple statement saying that I had no outstanding concerns about the legal basis of my land transaction. He wanted you to sign away any claim before a challenge could be filed," Clara said. "And he wanted it today." Ruth's jaw was set. "I told him I would need to consult my lawyer before signing anything." "Did he believe you?" "No," Ruth said flatly. "He's a man who has operated in this county for 25 years without serious opposition. He does not fully believe that the opposition he is now facing is as organized as it is because he arranged it to be disorganized." She paused. "But he is frightened. I have known Harold Vance for 20 years, and I have never seen him come to a door himself. He sends men for that. He came himself, which means his men are already deployed elsewhere, and he is running out of pieces to move." Clara thought of Whitfield riding through the night toward the county seat, carrying Aldrich's statement and the title review documents and the 3 pages of notarizations with their expired seal. She thought of the 4 families who had agreed to file alongside them, and the 2 who were leaning toward it, and the patient, methodical records that Ruth had been keeping for 6 years. She thought of Thomas Calloway, writing carefully in a letter he addressed to whoever his son might one day trust with this place. "He's going to come here next," Clara said. Ruth met her gaze. "I believe so." "Then I need you to stay." She looked at Ruth steadily. "Not as a witness. As yourself, as the woman who has been watching this for 6 years, and who has records that corroborate everything we've filed. If Vance comes here tonight and finds you here, it tells him something he needs to understand before this goes any further." "What does it tell him?" "That this is not one farm and one inconvenient wife," Clara said. "This is the community he has been working against for 25 years, and it has finally decided to work back." Ruth sat down. "Then I'll stay," she said simply. Harold Vance came at dusk, which was later than Clara had expected, and he came alone, which told her that the riders he had sent out in various directions had not yet returned with the results he needed, and he could not wait any longer. He was a tall man on a good horse, and he sat in his saddle with the posture of someone accustomed to arriving at places and having the arrival mean something, and when he came through the gate and saw the lights in the house and the 2 horses tied at the post, he slowed slightly before he continued forward. Clara opened the door before he knocked. He looked at her and then past her at Ruth McAllister sitting at the kitchen table, and something moved across his face that was not quite the composed pleasantness he had worn in his office 4 days ago, but a compressed working version of it, the mask held in place by will rather than confidence. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're always intruding, Mr. Vance," Clara said. "But come in." He came in because not coming in would have conceded something he was not ready to concede, and he stood in the middle of the kitchen in his good coat and his comfortable authority, and he looked around the room with the careful assessment of a man taking inventory. He looked at the organized papers on the table. He looked at Ruth. He looked at Clara. "I wanted to check in on how you were settling in," he said. "It's been a few days since the wedding, and I thought—" "Mr. Vance," Clara said, "James Whitfield reached the county seat this afternoon. He filed a formal challenge to the legal basis of the consolidated debt on this property at 4:47, which is 23 minutes before your man arrived to file a preemptive transfer claim." She watched his face. "The challenge carries Aldrich's signed statement as a supporting document. Aldrich gave his account voluntarily this morning before you had the opportunity to manage his version." Vance was very still. The pleasantness was gone now, not replaced by anger, but by a kind of cold, working assessment that was, she thought, probably his actual face, the one that lived beneath all the performance. "You've been busy," he said. "I've been doing what needed doing," Clara said. The title review pulled 47 documents notarized by Aldrich using an expired seal. 6 of those documents are directly associated with this property. Ruth has records on 10 additional properties in this county where the same pattern appears. She paused. "The territorial court will have all of that before the end of the week." "Legal challenges take time," Vance said. His voice was controlled, and she respected the control, even as she recognized it for what it was. "Months, sometimes years. In the meantime, the debt on this property remains, and the harvest—" "The debt on this property was created by documents that were not legally executed," Clara said. "A court reviewing those documents will have the option to void them entirely, which means the debt they created does not legally exist, which means there is nothing to call in and nothing to foreclose against." She held his gaze. "You know this. You have a lawyer. You've already been told this by someone today, which is why you went to Ruth's property yourself instead of sending a man." Vance looked at her for a long moment, and she understood that what she was seeing in his face was the specific experience of a man who had operated by a particular method for 25 years, encountering for the first time someone who had mapped the method completely before engaging with it. It was not defeat yet. It was the moment before a man decided whether to fight differently or to cut his losses, and she needed to make the second option feel more viable than the first. "You came to this house 4 days ago thinking you had placed someone inside it who would be useful to you," she said. "I want you to understand something clearly. I am not what you thought I was, and this farm is not what you thought it was, and the community you have been working against for 25 years is not what you thought it was." She moved nothing except her voice, which she kept level and precise. "Every family you have taken land from through these methods, every loan you constructed on fraudulent documentation, every property you acquired by waiting for hardship and then foreclosing on documents that were never legally sound, that is now in the hands of a lawyer who is riding through the night to make it part of a territorial court record." Vance set his hat on the table, which was a thing a man did when he was deciding to stop performing and start negotiating. "What do you want, Mrs. Calloway?" "I want you to leave this farm," she said. "Tonight, with the understanding that the debt you claim to hold here will be contested in court, and that contesting it will require you to explain under oath the relationship between your lending operation and Aldrich's notarizations going back to 1870. I want you to consider, before you decide how hard to fight what is coming, what a territorial judge will make of a man who arranged a marriage to consolidate leverage over a land dispute." She paused. "And I want you to understand that the 11 families on Ruth's list are not alone in this county. There are others who have not yet spoken. When a formal inquiry opens, they will." Vance picked up his hat. He was a composed man. She gave him that, a man who had learned over a long career to take the long view and absorb short-term reverses without showing the damage. He put on his hat, and he looked at her, and then he looked at Ruth, and then he walked to the door. At the door he stopped. "Your father's brother," he said without turning around. "Victor Holt." If you pursue this, the arrangement I had with him will come out in court as well, which means your father's name will be associated with a fraud case whether or not he was involved in the original action." Clara had anticipated this. She had thought about it carefully the night before, lying in the dark with the weight of it, and she had arrived at the place she needed to arrive at before she could handle it correctly. "My father's name is already associated with a debt he did not legitimately owe," she said. "A court inquiry that reveals that debt was manufactured by a fraud in which he was a victim rather than a participant will not damage him. It will clear him." She looked at Vance's back steadily. "You have just offered me a threat that points in the wrong direction. I would reconsider your position." He left. The door closed behind him, and the sound of his horse moving away from the house carried through the kitchen walls and faded into the evening quiet, and Clara stood very still in the middle of the room until it was fully gone. Ruth let out a long, slow breath. "Well," she said. "It's not finished," Clara said. "He'll find a way to contest. He'll look for leverage we haven't closed off. He has lawyers and money and 25 years of practice at this." "Yes," Ruth said, "but he doesn't have what he had this morning, which is the belief that he is the only person in this county who understands what he's built." She looked at Clara with those sharp, clear eyes. "You took that from him tonight. A man who knows he has been fully seen fights differently than a man who believes he's invisible. Usually worse." Eli came back 2 hours later, riding through full dark, and Clara heard the horse and was at the door again, and this time it was him, dusty from the road and tired in the way of a man who has ridden hard and fast and covered what needed to be covered. He came inside and she told him everything that had happened, standing at the table while he listened with that complete working attention, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "He came here himself," Eli said finally. "Yes. Because of you," he said. "Because you had moved faster than he thought was possible, and he had no other option." He looked at her, and the expression on his face was not complicated now, not the layered, careful thing she had been learning to read, but something much simpler and much more exposed. "Clara, Whitfield will be in contact when the court acknowledges the filing," she said, because she could hear what was coming in the way he said her name, and she wanted it said properly, rather than in the compressed urgency of a situation that was not yet fully resolved. "Whitfield can wait 30 seconds, Eli said. She looked at him. "I have been trying since the first morning to find the right words for what I want to say to you," he said, and his voice had the quality of a man who has decided that the cost of not saying something is higher than the cost of saying it imperfectly. "I'm not an eloquent man, I know that, but I want to say this clearly, so there is no version of it that you can misread." He moved closer, and she stood her ground, which was both a choice and not a choice, the way most of the important things in the past 4 days had been. "I did not understand when Vance proposed this arrangement what I was agreeing to. I thought I was making a practical decision under pressure. What I actually did was the luckiest thing I have ever done without knowing I was doing it." Clara looked up at him. "Eli, you came to this house and in 4 days you did what I have not been able to do in 4 years, he said. "Not because you're harder than me or smarter than me, though you are smarter than me, and I am at peace with that, but because you were willing to see the full shape of what we were up against and fight it at that scale, instead of the scale I could manage alone." He paused. "But that's not why I'm saying this. I'm saying this because somewhere between the first night and tonight, I stopped thinking of this as an arrangement and started thinking of it as my life. The actual one. The one I want." He held her gaze without flinching. "I know it's 4 days. I know that is not enough time to—" "It's enough time," Clara said. He stopped. "I said it was enough time," she repeated, and her voice was steady, in the way it was steady when she was saying something she had verified thoroughly and was certain of. "I am not a person who confuses gratitude with feeling, and I am not a person who says things she does not mean, and I am telling you that somewhere between the deed and the letter and the fence line. And tonight, I stopped keeping this at a careful distance." She held his gaze. I don't know exactly what this is yet, but I know it's real, and I know it's mine, and I know that I'm choosing it. Eli looked at her for a moment with the expression that she now understood was the one he reserved for things that mattered most. Everything present at once, and none of it hidden. Then he reached out and took her hand, the way a man takes something he intends to keep carefully and without apology, and she let him. And the kitchen was quiet around them, with the particular quality of quiet that comes after something long held in tension is finally released. Thomas Calloway's letter said the land was good and the water was clean, Clara said after a moment. It is, Eli said. He said men who wanted things they hadn't earned would always find reasons to take an interest in it. They will. He said whoever read the letter should know why he hadn't sold. She looked at Eli. Why didn't he sell? He wrote around it, but he never said it directly. Eli was quiet for a moment. Because this land was the place where his wife was buried, he said, and his father before her, and because he believed that the things worth keeping were the things worth fighting for, and that a man who sold what was worth keeping because the fight was hard had already lost something that no amount of money could replace. He paused. He used to say that the land doesn't belong to the man who holds the deed. It belongs to the man who was willing to stay. Clara thought about that, about Thomas Calloway writing careful letters and embedding restriction clauses in deeds and trusting that the right person would eventually come and find what he'd left. She thought about Ruth McAllister keeping her records for 6 years in the patient certainty that someday they would matter. She thought about her own father's ledger, 3 years of careful columns that had not saved the business, but had preserved the truth of what had happened to it, and how that truth had become the foundation of everything she had built in 4 days on this farm. She thought about Harold Vance riding away in the dark toward a town where, by morning, a territorial court filing would be sitting in the public record with his name on it, and Aldrich's statement beside it, and the weight of 11 families behind it. And she thought about how a man who had spent 25 years in the shadows of other people's hardship was about to discover what it felt like to conduct his business in full light. Whitfield will need the organized documents from the trunk for the court, she said. I have them ready. Tomorrow? Eli said. Tomorrow? She agreed. They stood together in the kitchen of the house that was hers now on the land that sat over clean water and had a restriction clause in its deed, and a community around it that had decided it was done being taken from. And the night outside was wide and dark and full of the endless Kansas wind, and it did not feel hostile the way it had felt to her on the first evening, but familiar, the sound of a place that knew her now because she had decided to know it back. 3 weeks later, the territorial court acknowledged the filing and suspended all foreclosure proceedings against 7 properties in Abilene County, pending a full inquiry into the legal basis of Harold Vance's lending documentation. By spring, 4 of those properties had received formal rulings that voided the debt instruments entirely. Vance contested, as Clara had known he would, and the contest took 2 years, and cost more than anyone had wanted to spend. But it was conducted in full public light in front of a territorial judge, who had no relationship with Vance's operation, and no reason to rule in his favor. And when it was finished, Harold Vance had lost the ability to conduct any lending business in the territory of Kansas under his own name, or the name of any entity he controlled. Ruth McAllister's list of 11 families was reduced by the end of that process to 3 who had come too late, or whose documentation had been clean enough to withstand the challenge. For those 3, Ruth organized a community fund the same way the community had organized before for barn raisings and disaster recovery, because that was what communities on the prairie did when one of them was in trouble and always had. James Whitfield built his practice on the foundation of that case and spent the next decade being the kind of lawyer that a county with a history of predatory lending specifically needed, which was one who understood exactly how the predation worked and where to look for the evidence of it. George Holt came to Abilene the following spring, hat in hand and older than his age, and sat at the kitchen table of his daughter's house, and met the man she had married under circumstances that still cost him sleep, and he stayed 4 days long enough to watch his daughter move through her life with the particular fluency of someone who has found the place where their abilities and their purpose have become the same thing. He left without asking for forgiveness because Clara had told him clearly that forgiveness was not a transaction and could not be scheduled, but they wrote to each other after that regularly in the careful, honest way of people who were learning a new language for a relationship that the old one had broken. On a morning in the second spring, Eli found Clara at the table before first light, which was where he had found her most mornings since the first one, except that this morning she was not looking at documents. She was looking at nothing in particular, with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and an expression on her face that he recognized as the one she wore when she had finished calculating something and arrived at the answer. "What is it?" he said. She looked up at him. "There's something I need to tell you." He sat down. "I think we're going to need more room in this house," she said. Eli looked at her for a moment, and the expression that moved across his face was the fully unguarded one, the one that came when something outpaced his ability to be careful about showing it. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then we'll build more room," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what we do." Outside, the Kansas morning was breaking open in its enormous, indifferent way, pouring light across the good land and the clean water and the farm that had been worth fighting for. The farm that two people had chosen to stay on when staying was harder than leaving, and had built into something that would outlast both of them piece by piece, day by day, with the particular stubborn grace of people who understood that the things worth keeping were always in the end the things worth fighting for, and that the fight itself, undertaken together and in full honesty, was how love became permanent.